It was past midnight on August 31st, 1888, when Polly Nichols left a rooming house in the East End district of London known as Whitechapel. Somewhere in the darkness, she met a knife-wielding stranger with a ruthless motive. This stranger would kill repeatedly during the next 10 weeks, always suddenly, always silently. And with each victim grew a murderous legacy that spread suspicion, fear, and panic. And even now, arouses fascination. The discovery of Polly Nichols' body at 3:40 a.m. in Bucks Row was in itself no cause for panic in the East End of London. Crime was an everyday fact of life here, and women were not uncommon victims.
Working class women were no strangers to violence. The East End was a rough place. Working class marriages were often abusive.
Yet this killing did not have the look of a domestic dispute gone wrong. What set it apart was its savagery. The murderer made 2 deep cuts along Polly Nichols' neck, nearly severing her head from her body. 9 days after Polly Nichols' murder on September the 8th, another brutal slaying occurred in Whitechapel. This time the victim was a woman named Annie Chapman. Accounts of the Whitechapel murders spread like wildfire, fueled by newspapers only too eager to feed the public's voracious appetite for details.
Another murder of character even more diabolical than that perpetrated in Bucks Row. Her throat was cut in a fearful manner. The woman's body had been completely ripped open, and the heart and other organs laying about the place, and portions of the entrails around the victim's neck.
Police surgeon Dr. George Bagster Phillips examined Chapman's body some 2 hours after her death. His conclusions narrowed the field of potential suspects.
The injuries could have been done by such an instrument as a medical man used for post-mortem purposes. Those used by slaughtermen might have caused them. Knives in the leather trade would not be long enough in the blade. The mode in which these portions were extracted showed anatomical knowledge. Obviously the work was that of an expert.
When Phillips' report was made public, it unleashed a frenzy of accusation. Immediately suspicion fell upon those who used knives in their work, like doctors, butchers and barbers. The Whitechapel murders fell under the jurisdiction of Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren. His Assistant Commissioner for Crime was Dr. Robert Anderson, who picked Chief Inspector Donald Swanson and Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline to head up the investigation.
Overall charge of the investigation was given to Chief Inspector Donald Swanson. Now, he is often described as the office man in charge at Scotland Yard, but he did in fact go out and do some inquiries himself, so he was very much part of the investigation as well as overseeing it.
Aberline was an ex-watchmaker, very meticulous man. He was into surveillance, and there's a fair bit of evidence that they disguised a lot of detectives out on the ground.
And also you had the vigilance committees on the street and private individuals who thought they were going to catch the murderer on the street.
The vigilance committees were made up of local residents frustrated by what they saw as the police's lack of progress. Among them, George Lusk headed Whitechapel's most prominent vigilance committee. He was a vocal critic of the investigation who would later play a more direct role in the case. Then, on September the 27th, a startling development. Now 19 days after the second murder, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency.
Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I'm down on oars, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work, and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue, and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers, just for jolly. Wouldn't you? Keep this letter till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife is so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Now there was a name for the Whitechapel murderer. The newspapers printed the letter a few days later, popularizing the killer's nickname while sending waves of terror throughout the city. In addition to coverage laced with blood-curdling passages, London's tabloids also took aim at Commissioner Warren of the Metropolitan Police. Their editorials and cartoons demanded his resignation. Meanwhile, life for many in the East End grew more desperate. Liz Stride's fears were prophetic. On September 30th, 3 days after the Ripper letter appeared, she met her final customer, but this time there was a witness. His name was Israel Schwartz, at this point the only person who might positively identify the killer.
Schwartz said he saw a person struggling with 1:45 in the morning. Saw him struggling with the lady who he recognised, identified as Stride.
She was thrown to the ground. She cried out about 2 or 3 times. And Schwartz at that point had walked on, and he saw a man who was threatening, or he thought was threatening, and he ran away.
Stride's body was found a short time later, just off Berner Street. Her throat was cut, but there were no other mutilations.
The Stride murder is different from the other Ripper crimes in as much as he didn't mutilate the body. But there are a number of reasons for this. One, the most popular explanation, is at the arrival of a man called Louis Diemschutz, who'd been away at a market that day, and he arrived back with his horse and cart and discovered that he was the man who actually discovered the body. It's thought that his arrival, that the Ripper was probably hiding in the shadows somewhere and then made his escape whilst there was all the confusion going along following the discovery of the body.
The killer fled west a few blocks, encountering another woman outside a nearby church.
On the other side of the street, not far from this church, Catherine Eddowes was picked up by Jack the Ripper. Eddowes was seen at 1:35 a.m. talking to her killer with her hand on his chest.
Within 10 minutes of last being seen, Catherine Eddowes was dead. At 1:45 a.m., a police constable found her mutilated body in Mitre Square, only a few hundred yards from the church.
The face had been slashed down both cheeks. There may have been an attempt to cut off one of her ears. One of the cuts had gone through the tip of her nose, which dropped off into the clothing when the body was picked up. The throat had been cut back to the spine. The clothes had been pushed up, forced up. The insides lifted out and dropped over her right shoulder. And nobody had seen or heard a thing. Not the policeman on the beat, the policeman and his family there, the night porter there, or the witnesses out there. Now remember, this is the second killing in 40 minutes.
The pair of killings would become known as the double event.
The double killing is believed to have occurred because he was so psyched up after the first killing. He hadn't time to complete what he'd wanted to do.
Police were certain the Ripper had committed both crimes because of their proximity and an eyewitness, Israel Schwartz.
He saw them fight, and he saw the guy hit Liz Stride, and she fell to the floor with a scream. And then 15, 20 minutes later, she's found dead, from my point of view and from most people's point of view, that's important because if you think it's possible that Liz Stride was attacked by two people that night within 15 minutes of each other, the chances of that may be a little remote.
In addition to an eyewitness, the police found something more.
A couple of blocks to the east of Mitre Square, he threw a piece of blood-stained apron into the doorway of numbers 108 to 119 Galston Street. This was Edo's apron, so it was definitely thrown down by the killer. Above this piece of apron, on the jamb of the door, was written a message in chalk: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing."
The anti-Semitic climate in the community led Commissioner Warren to make a questionable investigative decision.
Detectives were stationed by this doorway so that a photograph could be taken of the message once it was daylight. But now the incredible happens. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner, ex-Army man Sir Charles Warren, orders the message to be rubbed from the wall without any photographs being taken of it. When the detectives protest and ask why, well, says Warren, there are lots of Jews living in this area. This could be an incitement to race riots.
Police surgeon Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown performed the autopsy on Catherine Eddowes.
The peritoneal lining was cut through on the left side, and the left kidney carefully taken out and removed. To have removed the kidney and to know where it was placed, such a knowledge might be possessed by someone in the habit of cutting up animals.
Brown's report revived theories that the Ripper was a doctor, a tradesman skilled with a knife, or a madman experienced in anatomy. Missing from Eddowes' body was not only her kidney, but, like Chapman, her womb. In the wake of these four horrific murders, all of London shuddered, wondering not if, but when the killer would strike again. By October 1888, the police had launched an all-out search for Whitechapel's elusive serial killer.
The murders are concentrated in a very, very tiny area, and there was an absolute terror in the Whitechapel and the surrounding districts. You have this enormous petition put up from the women of Whitechapel, 40,000 women petitioning Queen Victoria, you know, sort of to get something done about the murders.
Then, on October the 16th, the gruesome case took a ghoulish turn. George Lusk of Whitechapel's Mile End Vigilance Committee received a small parcel in the mail. Inside it, a piece of human kidney and a letter addressed, "From Hell."
Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you off the kidney I took from one, preserved it for you. T'other piece I frawed and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if you only wait a while longer. Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk.
The doctor of pathology at London Hospital confirmed it came from a 45-year-old woman who suffered from Bright's disease, a condition brought on by alcoholism.
The pathologist's description of the remaining kidney in Eddowes' body was that it was pale, bloodless and congested at the pyramids, which in fact was a sign of Bright's disease.
Yes, the piece of kidney was genuine. She suffered from Bright's disease. This piece of kidney matched up with the fragment inside Catherine Eddowes.
During the late 1880s, in the wake of Darwin's theory of evolution, criminology linked human behavior to biological factors. Distinctive physical traits and facial features were believed to reveal criminal types who were seen as more ape-like creatures, not as fully developed as most humans. November 9th, 1888. Over a month after the double event, an uneasy calm had settled on the Whitechapel district. Mary Jane Kelly, a young woman in her 20s, is seen by a witness leaving a pub with a man sometime around 3 a.m. She invites her companion inside her lodging house at 13 Miller's Court. Just before 4 a.m., 3 women living in the room above Kelly reported hearing a cry of murder. But it was hours before her fate was known. She was the 5th victim killed in 10 weeks, all of them murdered within a mile of each other.
Mary Kelly was behind with a rent, and a landlord sent someone round to sort of ask her for the rent. And when the messenger didn't get any answer by knocking on the door, he went round to the side of the room where there was a broken window, pushed out the rags and newspaper, putting his hand through the glass, he pulled back the curtain, and then he saw the body of Mary Kelly.
It was a total evisceration of the body. He'd severed the head from the body. He then skinned the face. He'd opened it from the throat to the groin, from the knee to the groin was opened up.
A horrific sight, even for veteran detectives Abberline and Swanson. This was the Ripper's most vicious attack yet.
In victim number 5, for the very first time, he had a private environment. The victim took him to her flat. And at that point in time, he was not going to be disturbed. So he could engage in every type of deviant, lustful desire that he had without the possibility of being disturbed and without any time constraints.
Political pressures and the strain of the Ripper murders weighed heavily on Commissioner Warren. The day before Mary Kelly's killing, he resigned his position. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson remained on as supervisor with Detectives Swanson and Abberline investigating, but police efforts seemed hopelessly thwarted. In a desperate attempt to find Mary Kelly's killer, government authorities offered a pardon to anyone supplying information leading to the apprehension and conviction of the murderer.
Now that indicates that they thought that more than one person was involved, or that somebody had information about it. It's a very odd move to make, to go to the Home Office and for the Home Secretary to issue a pardon in advance to a co-conspirator.
The pardon offer went unanswered, and for weeks nothing happened. Then, the murders stopped. Just 3 months after Mary Kelly's death, the police reduced their patrols in Whitechapel.
The interesting thing for me is the murders stop, but in less time than the time between 2 of the murders in the middle of a series, the whole inquiry is stood down. So I think the cops obviously knew something that we don't know.
There was an account, a Masonic account, of the punishment by the biblical King Solomon of the 3 Jews who are said to have murdered his master mason who built his Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And according to this Masonic account, these 3 Jews were punished by the biblical King Solomon by having their throats cut, their breasts burst open, and their bodies scattered. And in the Masonic references to those 3 Jews, the word Jews was spelled J-U-W-E-S, exactly as it was written in this doorway over here. So how Eddowes died on the spelling of the word Jews, that is what has led to the suggestion that the murderer was either a Freemason or knew something about Freemasonry.
The suspect was a man named Kosminski, a Polish Jew who, according to McNaughton, possessed a great hatred of women and had strong homicidal tendencies. There were many reasons that made Kosminski a prime suspect, but one seemed particularly telling. Dr. Robert Anderson, Deputy Commissioner under Sir Charles Warren, published an autobiography some 20 years after the murders. He called it The Lighter Side of My Official Life. Detective Donald Swanson, who worked under Anderson, had read the book, scribbling notes along the margins. In 1987, a descendant of Swanson had those notes printed in the Daily Telegraph. What they revealed was startling, that Swanson and Anderson knew exactly who Jack the Ripper was.
Swanson, in some notes that he made in his own personal copy of Sir Robert Anderson's autobiography, identified that individual as somebody called Kosminski.
He wrote in the margin of that book, yes, we did know who Jack the Ripper was at the time, and he said it was Kosminski. And he actually said Kosminski.
The same Kosminski Chief Constable McNaughton had listed in his memorandum. He was a man not unknown to the police. Shortly after Liz Stride's murder, Israel Schwartz identified Kosminski in a police lineup. But there was a problem. Schwartz refused to testify against him.
Schwartz identified Kosminski as the man he had seen that night. Now this, of course, is the only evidence the police have got. There's no forensic, nothing else. It's got to be something like this. But Schwartz refused to give evidence at court. He claimed that he was Jewish, Kosminski was Jewish, and he would not have the death of another Jew on his conscience.
According to Swanson, the reason he refused to testify was because he knew that his testimony would send this person to the gallows.
Without that testimony, police had no grounds to hold Kosminski.
He was released into the custody of his brother, who lived in Whitechapel, who looked after him. And he was then, according to all the police records, he was watched continuously. And they followed him 24 hours a day through the East End of London. No more murders ever took place. And then sometime later he was taken from the home, taken to a mental institution, and spent the rest of his time there.
A fairly thorough search of asylum records has shown that there's only one Kosminski who was committed to an asylum, and he was committed to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, and his name was Aaron Kosminski.
There's only three ways this is going to end, isn't there? It's either the person goes abroad, they die, or they're incarcerated. But all aid was stood down to the East End of London at Christmas 1888. Now that tells you that the police officers then were pretty sure they knew who Jack the Ripper was. To actually cancel all the aid at that early, only a month, 6 weeks after the last murder, tells you they knew, they were convinced, absolutely convinced, that they knew who Jack the Ripper was.
Yet if the police did know the Ripper's identity, why they didn't publicise it becomes another mystery.
In 1888, they looked at Ostrog, they looked at Druitt, but they were convinced it was Kosminski. Now, people would come up with all different things, but as I said before, if it was good enough for the investigating officers at the time, it's good enough for me 110 years later. And there's no doubt that since then, as far as I'm concerned, from my point of view, from a policeman's point of view, all other suspects would go out of the window.
Our profile fit one of the suspects almost dead bang, and that was an individual by the name of Kosminski.
On the night of the murder of Catherine Eddowes, when she was found in Mitre Square by PC Watkins, there was a shawl left by the body. When she was taken to the mortuary, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson accompanied Catherine Eddowes and asked could he take the shawl because it's a huge piece of silk and his wife is a seamstress. Because Amos Simpson took that shawl, I've managed to conclusively prove scientifically from the evidence left therein the identity of Jack the Ripper. In March 2007, I became aware that there was a shawl purported to belong to Catherine Eddowes at the time for sale in an auction house near to where I lived. I did some research into the provenance of the shawl, and from there I went and bought it. Catherine Eddowes is acknowledged as the fourth murder victim of Jack the Ripper. She lived in an area where there were 1,200 unfortunates at the time of the murders. She was released from Bishopsgate Police Station. She collided with Jack the Ripper, unfortunately for her, and within 20 minutes her body was found butchered in Mitre Square. The very first day I allowed this shawl to be tested, we were told that we have blood spatter in the form of slashing, possible semen stains, possible blood stains, possible fecal matter, all of which as the shawl is covered in. It was extremely exciting.
When I first saw the shawl, I was quite surprised because it was much bigger than I thought it was, and it was much more colourful and floral. We were looking what the stains actually were, so we were testing for blood using conventional methods, and then also using different crime lights to pinpoint what the stains are. We had some stains which were consistent with sperm stains, and we also found some larger stains which were compatible with internal organ stains. So the patterns were matching the modus operandi of Jack the Ripper. Next we had to isolate the DNA from the stains and then match with the descendant. This DNA extraction and analysis was quite difficult because the DNA is quite old, because the shawl is quite old.
We have to find a descendant down the female line because of the DNA, and that's the only way we could link the stains on the shawl to a descendant. The other stains that we found on the shawl, we had to link through the sister of the murderer, through again the female line, which was the only way we could get a match. So we can give a name to Jack the Ripper. It's Aaron Kosminski. He was a 23-year-old Polish Jewish immigrant who lived very close to the murders. Aaron Kosminski was identified but couldn't be arrested. He was then admitted into Coney Hatch Asylum. From there, he was taken to Leavesden Asylum, where he died in 1919 at the age of 54.